So without further ado, one of my favorite people, Bruce Katz. He's one of my favorite people because of all he has contributed to the Rhode Island our economic development strategy, restructuring the way we think. And I love the way he listens, he hears, and others hear him too. So thank you, Bruce, for all you've done for Rhode Island. And thank you, as Avi said, for making the time to be here. For any of you who don't know Bruce, Bruce Katz is the founding director of the Nowak, I think I say it right, Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Previously, he served as the inaugural Centennial Scholar at Brookings Institution and as vice president and director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program for 20 years. He is a member of the RSA City Growth Commission in the United Kingdom and a visiting professor in practice at London School of Economics. Bruce previously served as chief of staff to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and staff director of the Senate Subcommittee on Housing and Urban Affairs. He knows what he's talking about. Bruce co-led the Obama administration's Housing and Urban Transition Team. He is co-author of The Metropolitan Revolution and the New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. He's the editor or co-editor of several books on urban and metropolitan issues and a frequent media commentator. He is one of my favorite content providers. I follow him religiously on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I suggest that you do as well. Today, Bruce is going to address economic recovery needs from COVID-19 and all of his research work on small business recovery and Main Street regeneration. The mission of his work is to help cities design, finance, and deliver transformative initiatives that promote inclusive and sustainable growth. And without further ado, Bruce Katz.
Thanks, Tuni. It's great to see everyone. And I think Mary's gonna share a screen so I could go through a particular presentation. So essentially, for the past 4 or 5 months, it's actually, as all of you know, it's really hard to know, what day it is and how long we've been in this situation. But I've been working on, with local, state, and federal officials and private civic actors, how to respond to what essentially is a small business-led recession. And one thing about, as I start this to sort of understand, is the US at the national level does not collect information about small business, first of all, on a timely basis. First of all, the definition of small business is quite broad. Any firm with less than 500 employees, where if we went out on the street today in Providence and asked, hey, what do you think is a small business? They probably say less than 10. So the definition is very broad. And every 5 years or so, what the federal government does is it does a very intensive survey of a portion of small businesses to understand their revenues, their payrolls, their employees, what sector they're in, race, ethnicity, gender, yada, yada, right? The challenge is they do this every 5 years. The last time they did this in 2017, they actually cut the budget. So what normally would be a more robust survey was degraded when they did this in 2017. But it's the best national data that we have right now on the eve of COVID. And so I thought I'd walk through some of this. I'm particularly focusing on Black-owned business, but the survey obviously gives us an insight into other groups. So let's just start with the big picture. We're only looking at employer firms in this survey. In past surveys, they actually looked at sole proprietorships and firms with employees. Because they cut the budget, they're only looking at the 5.7 million firms that actually have employees. Of those 5.7 million firms, about 124,000 are Black-owned. Only 2.2%. Blacks are 14% of the United States population. So right off the bat, we're seeing an enormous gap, which really hasn't moved very much over a very long period of time. So when we get to solutions, we need to really understand that we need to get our act together here. Next slide. So as you'll see, the yellow is Black-owned, I'm actually colorblind, so the middle is what, is that green or gray? I'm not sure. You know, the middle column.
It's green.
Sorry about that. It's always an issue with these things. So what you'll see is that there's not that big of a difference in terms of number of employees in establishments between Black-owned and white-owned. All businesses is a little odd because it includes very large corporations. It's another problem with the way the survey is done. But when we did the sort of, you know, substantial granular breakdown, there's not that much different in number of employees. The real difference, as you can tell, is average annual revenue and annual payroll, where again, there are huge disparities. Now, this really matters because when you think about Black-owned business and you think about the Paycheck Protection Program, that was the main way in which the federal government tried to stabilize businesses. These firms have less revenue, less capital. They tend to have fewer banking relationships, which have been in place for a long period of time. So depending on banks as the delivery system for the PPP, almost guaranteed that a whole number of Black-owned businesses weren't going to get those loans. So it's really important to understand the starting points. Next slide. The reason why Black-owned businesses have less revenue is they're in sectors of the economy, disproportionately represented in sectors of the economy, and in parts of those sectors that tend to have low revenue and low wages. So they're disproportionately in healthcare and social assistance, and particularly those parts of healthcare and social assistance like home care aides, for example, that tend not to pay very much. And you know, when you go to the report that Toonie just put up, you can begin to look through the sector analysis to see where Black-owned businesses are concentrated. This really matters because if we want to have a goal as a nation right now, it's not just the number of Black-owned businesses that matter. During the Democratic primary campaign, Mike Bloomberg called for doubling the number of Black-owned businesses. That can't be the only goal. It has to be size, scale, and sector representation. We have to make a very clear decision as a country that we're going to bring Black-owned businesses and Latino businesses as well, and women-owned businesses into the heart of the American economy. When we get to solutions, we can talk through that. Next slide. So now we get to the states. And so what we've done so far are 2 reports, breaking it down at the national level, breaking it down at the state level. We have another report coming up, breaking it down at the city, county, and metro level. You know, the challenge again with this survey is because they cut the budget. Once you get below the metro scale, the data sucks. That's the technical term, right? So at the national and state level, it's generally okay. But once you get to metro and below, we begin to lose the integrity of the data. But not surprisingly, if you look at the percentage of businesses that are Black-owned, where are they? They tend to be in the states, many in the deep South, where you have a large percentage of Black residents, right? And so you see DC, Maryland, Georgia, Mississippi, Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama. Those are your top states, right? And that's where you have percentages, high percentages. Rhode Island is a little bit in the middle. Next slide. The real question, or the way to really look at this, is to look at the number of, there's a yay for North Carolina, look at the number of inhabitants per Black-owned business. In the United States, and we're talking about employer-owned firms here. So in the United States, there's usually 55 inhabitants per business in the US. Oregon, which really doesn't have a very large Black population for a whole bunch of historic reasons, some of which are not very pretty, does very well here. There are 130 inhabitants per business. Rhode Island has about 238 per business. So bottom line, you're lagging, we're lagging the norm of 55 inhabitants per business, which covers white, Latino, women, everything. bottom line, we need more Black-owned businesses. It's not like a rocket science, but it does differ. And then one interesting thing to think about is, before I showed you the deep South states are doing very well because they have high proportion of Black residents. But, look at, Alabama, Mississippi. They have 712 inhabitants per business, or 715 per business. Once you actually break it down, so you get into these apples to apples comparison, they're not doing very well, is the bottom line. So just because, it looks good at the number of businesses, it doesn't, when you actually use this better comparison, they don't look as good. Next slide. Now we get into a lot. You should just read the report to go into this detail. The bottom line is we're looking at change, both by percentage and by absolute number of firms. Rhode Island is a state that has a share of Black population which is below the American median, so we put it in the bottom slide. And there, you're actually performing relatively well in terms of growing 117 businesses. It doesn't sound like a lot, but one of the things to notice here is there are a bunch of states that, according to this survey, literally saw the number of Black-owned businesses between 2012 and 2017 go down. It's hard to really imagine that that could happen. Obama was president. We were in the middle of an economic rebound, but there's a whole bunch of states that actually saw the number of Black-owned businesses be reduced. That could be a sector phenomenon. This could be a hangover from the recession. We're trying to understand these numbers. But Rhode Island at least has a growth, which is good. Next slide. And now we're looking at percentage change of all businesses Black-owned between 2012 and 2017. And Rhode Island does perform relatively well here, again, from a relatively small base. Next slide. So when we go into the numbers, in 2012, only 0.74% of all employer firms in Rhode Island were Black-owned. 170 firms, only 170 firms. That grew to 287 firms. Your percentage went up in 2017. Good news, but you're below the national average of 2.2%. But again, it's from a small base. And the number of employees in these 287 firms is about 2,500, give or take. So not substantial numbers here. There's a lot of work. Next slide. Bottom line, the country's got a lot of work to do, right? We've had inclusion goals. In some cases, we've had minority set-asides on the books for a very, very long period of time. I thought we would have seen more progress between 2012 and 2017. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from this survey is we need to do more on the demand side of the equation. Corporations, universities, hospitals, financial institutions, governments, they're going to have to do a lot more work to basically take what they're purchasing, the goods and services they're purchasing, and make sure that if Black-owned businesses exist in some of these sectors, they're getting some of that business. And if they don't exist, what's the path to grow them? It's not sufficient just to say, well, there are no Black-owned businesses or Latino-owned businesses in this sector. Let's move on. We need a different kind of modus operandi now, given these numbers. One thing I'll talk about with a little specificity is what we're talking about, what we're labeling Main Street regenerators. So think about a city, a town that has a downtown, a business district, a commercial corridor, a main street. When we come back from this series of pandemics, many of the businesses will have been shuttered and many of the properties will be vacant. And if our notion is that each business by itself will somehow snap back, that's delusional. So we're going to need different kind of business models and different kinds of intermediaries to make this happen. That's what we're calling a regenerator. Next slide. Here's the scene set. We're significant decrease in spending. We're interestingly enough, this study that was done by Raj Chetty out of Harvard and Stanford shows that the greatest decline is within affluent communities and low-wage jobs within them. That's where you're seeing the biggest impact. But bottom line, a health pandemic led to an economic shutdown, which basically led to face-to-face Main Street businesses really having the bulk of the impact. Next slide. Now, minority businesses or minority-owned businesses were disproportionately affected. There was a disparate impact on these businesses. Going back to the data I showed before, they're smaller, they have less revenue, they have less capital reserves, they have less of a runway to survive a shutdown, and they don't really have the mainstream banking relationships, which was the main distribution vehicle for the federal relief. So I think we're going to come out of this seeing a larger loss in Black-owned business in particular than small businesses as a whole. Next slide. It really matters to grow Black-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color in general, because this is a vehicle both for asset building, wealth building, but also local hiring. The more local minority-owned businesses we have in our communities, labor market participation in those neighborhoods will go up, and local spending will be kept local as opposed to going to dollar stores or other big box retail. Next slide. So Main Streets really matter. They do have the potential, if we rethink their function and purpose, to be vibrant, both centers of commerce and community life. We have many successful Main Streets pre-COVID, and frankly in Rhode Island as well. But in many Black neighborhoods, what we've seen is an underutilization of commercial space over many decades. Next slide. So what we're doing right now is refocusing on the fundamentals. What is the function and purpose of a Main Street in a city, or a commercial corridor, or a business district? The thesis for many years is that they would draw their power from local residents, purchasing power, right? We don't think that's sufficient given the incomes of residents in many of these communities. So what we're pushing in Cincinnati and St. Louis and Pittsburgh and other cities is a rethink around demand, and trying to sort through whether it's demand from anchors, what these larger institutions purchase, goods and services, whether it's firm demand, professional service firms, other firms, or whether it's nonprofit demand. Could we begin to connect that demand with the supply of Main Streets and the supply of Black-owned businesses? We haven't, to tell you the truth, focused on just that kind of basic matching between demand and supply for decades. I mean, literally for decades. This has like been on autopilot. And so as you look at this typical Main Street, this is actually a real Main Street in Covington, Kentucky. We're trying to rethink what its raison d'etre is, and then basically begin to mediate between demand and supply in multiple ways. Next slide. So the notion of a regenerator, you know, many Main Streets have a merchant association, they have a business improvement district, they might have a community development corporation. What we're basically saying is those intermediaries, in whole or in part, or in partnership with other entities in their city or county or state, will need to perform some new functions. Most of the functions they perform now are placemaking, clean and safe, place management, place marketing. There's going to be a real need for filling vacant properties, reconfiguring streetscapes, so restaurants can spill out into the street, providing common services to businesses, all the deep cleaning that all these firms and establishments are going to have to carry out. Maybe that should be done in a cooperative fashion. Maybe all the rents should be paid in certain main streets for the next 3 years by certain entities, a master leasing, a master tenancy, and then to give the link to capital. But the one piece that we've been really thinking about is how do you take a particular main street, many of which are actually located fairly close to hospitals and universities and corporations, et cetera, and how do you begin to link demand and supply? I think many of us know that when you go to many of these communities and you walk 5 blocks, you'll see one of these anchor institutions, and there's not really an enormous amount of connect there, right? They are providing jobs for local residents, perhaps, and the incomes of the people who are work at these places obviously spill out, you know, and support state and local revenues. But there's not as much of a connection as there needs to be. Ultimately, as we begin to grow more businesses, we can begin to grow more work opportunities for local residents. And this has an enormous flywheel effect on health outcomes, income outcomes, ultimately well. Next slide. Well, thank you. So anyway, you could download all this at the Nowak lab. You can connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Very happy to open this up for a conversation right now.
Some of the questions that Russell just said, when we're saying support Black-owned business, but we're not supporting them, when the program language changes to minorities or low income, who preferably are white women, white LG. Can you respond to that one, Bruce, or?
Well, I think the way in which the U.S. has defined supplier diversity or inclusion, inclusive procurement, let's say, has been around these broader groups and constituencies. The bottom line, if you want to grow Black-owned business, or you want to help start Black-owned business, or if you want to help existing Black-owned businesses shift to other sectors that pay better wages and have more revenues, you better be unbelievably intentional and purposeful about it, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, because the federal government in particular, which has led the way on most of this stuff, does have quote unquote disadvantaged groups at times grouped together. And so this does require ecosystems which have enormous amount of intentionality behind them, and frankly set goals and hold themselves accountable with multiple partners, so that you could at the end of the day say, okay, have we moved the ball forward here? So I think there needs to be a particular special focus on Black-owned business for all the reasons that you were talking about when I got on the phone. I mean, there's a long history here of extraction, of discrimination, of institutional racism. I mean, this is at the core of our societal disparities. So there has to be a super effort here. And it's going to require, from my perspective, this is an institutional issue. You need intermediaries that have capacity, that have capital, and have community standing, have trust in these communities if you're going to make some change. So I don't think, I think we do have a platform of goals, and the Obama administration actually made some real progress on this in the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. If you really want to read something that's riveting, read the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. But so there was progress made. But I do think that there's a gap between federal goal setting and what happens in the real world. The real world are main streets and business districts and commercial corridors and cities and towns and counties and states. That's the real world. So the gap is very large between goals set at the national level and then what happens on the ground.
Mhm.
We got to close that gap.
I don't know if you're following the chat. Avi just made a good statement. I think about how the lack of access to capital has historically forced many Black and Latinx businesses to execute micro business models. We need to encourage diversity in wider sectors and support scalable business model generation in these communities.
Now, these are great comments. I think, so on the capital side, I think there's many things to say. We have a debt model, really, with SBA lending. We've had it for decades. It hasn't really been rethought for decades, right? And debt requires certain kinds of collateral. It again defies the kind of history we were just talking about. So I think there are experiments underway with more equity models for investment in startups. You know, the startup community should not just be about tech, right? Quote unquote. It should be around some of these local serving businesses. So we might be able to transfer over equity products to complement the debt products we already have. Fintech is playing a much bigger role now. Community banks and CDFIs are playing a substantial role. When you really see the difference between outcomes by race and by ethnicity or by size of firm from the federal relief packages, a lot of it is whether you have a distribution system in your state or your city state, CDFIs, community banks. The large banks, frankly, don't want to do these loans. I mean, you know, they can say they want to do them, but they don't, you know, so we can keep on a Don Quixote exercise trying to get them to do it, but my gut sense is we need a different kind of institutional system here.
Can you talk, I'm sorry to cut you out. Can you talk a little bit about the Senators Daines and Booker and what they're trying to get pushed through?
Yeah, so a couple of my colleagues and I put out a newsletter a couple months ago. I put out a blog every week or so on thenewlocalism.com. And what we basically said, this is right before PPP, I think, was actually enacted, the Paycheck Protection Program. We basically said, this is not going to work for a whole segment of American business. Like, this is not a rocket science, you know? These folks are underbanked, and this whole process you set up is really about people who have a friendly banker who calls them and says, hey, by the way, we now have this new federal program. Here's what you need to send to me. That's basically how PPP worked, you know, until it was amended and modified. So what we basically said, we were tracking all these local relief funds and state relief funds that were set up in March when the economic shutdown occurred. And these relief funds, for the most part, were just providing $5,000 grants, $10,000 grants. They did what the Swiss did and the Germans did with small business. They just used grant products as opposed to loan products. And we said what the federal government should do is just top up those local and state relief funds. Not instead of PPP, keep the PPP going because it's serving a certain segment of American business. But in a country this, you know, complicated, set up this other distribution channel. So Senator Booker and Senator Daines liked that idea. What they propose is the Relief for Main Street Act, $50 billion that would go directly to city, counties, and states. And those city, counties, and states would then top up these relief funds and get the money to the, you know, get the capital fit to purpose, you know, particularly for small firms and for, you know, businesses owned by people of color. Literally, Congress is going to decide in the next 3 weeks whether to put the Relief for Main Street Act as part of the next coronavirus package. So, you know, this is when you say, call your congressman, you know, actually call your senator, because it's really important that this other distribution vehicle be enacted in addition as a complement to the Paycheck Protection Program. So this is still underway. I mean, it hasn't been decided. And $50 billion obviously sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But this Relief Act, the next one is 1.2 trillion or 1.5 trillion. This is more likely to get to those businesses that have been underserved and the communities and the business districts in which they're located. I hope that, I hope that's clear.
No, yeah. Ruth asked if you can say something about the potential impact of the microloans.
Well, yeah, there are, under another part of the federal relief program, this was under the traditional SBA economic injury disaster loan. There was some $10,000 grants that were provided for people who applied. That was very popular. And SBA, which normally is fairly sluggish in these kinds of environments, I think has tried their best to respond. My view is we need all of the above. I mean, we're a country of 320 million people, right? With 5.7 million employer firms and another 25 million sole proprietorships and so forth. We need multiple distribution channels and multiple forms of capital. There's no one size fits all in this country. We're just too damn big, right? So I think what would happen with the Booker bill is if you put money to city, counties, and states, and they topped up local relief, they can also be a vehicle for microloans. So we need all of this. It's not a time to say we have one solution, narrow path, because we know what the impact of that is.
And as Rhode Island's economic gardener, when you said, we don't have a supportive infrastructure here, or at least a robust one, I, of course, feel like in the past 6 years, we've made so much headway and have so many more resources than we ever had in Rhode Island. Can you let us know, like, who's doing it well, so we can continue to study and model other areas in the country that are doing it well?
Well, here's the bottom line. I think Rhode Island has made an enormous leap forward in building an innovation infrastructure, particularly around certain clusters of your economy. And increasingly, I think you're going to own a piece of the blue economy. And that increasingly is recognized, not just domestically, but globally. The other thing that you do unbelievably well in Rhode Island is this Real Jobs RI. You connect the way very few places connect career and technical education in the high schools, to community colleges, to workforce development, to four-year like Rhode Island College or University of Rhode Island. So you're really good at that, and it tends to be company-led and cluster-led. You're much better at this than just about anyone else in the US, to tell you the truth. No one, of course, gives you credit for it, because Rhode Islanders, tough group, right? Where you fall short is an ecosystem around growing, supporting, nurturing, mentoring Black and brown-owned business. This is where you fall short. And so what we recommended in the last economic plan was that you take a look at Cincinnati, which we think is really the top of the apex of the US hierarchy on this. And that's because P&G, Procter & Gamble, has been practicing inclusive supplier diversity since the 70s at scale, right? The chamber, the main chamber, has a minority business accelerator staffed with serious people. I mean, former bankers, former procurement officers from the federal government. I mean, a normal chamber would love to have these people, and they're running the minority business accelerator. They have former P&G employees in Cincinnati who advise their universities and hospitals about how, when they do master campus development, the pre-construction, the construction, and the post-construction, not just the construction trades, but the architects, the engineers, the lawyers, the professional services, and all the other goods and services are basically staffed, or a portion is staffed by Black-owned business in particular, because that's the dynamic in Cincinnati. So it's an ecosystem in essence. I mean, it's a complete ecosystem which has been built up, some of it over the last 40 years, not the last 5 years. So that's what we recommended in the report. You're never going to replicate Cincinnati exactly, you know, but you can adapt what they've done and what they've learned. And their folks are just, I mean, they're cracking it, you know, I mean, they really get it.
Is that what we modeled the Supply RI program after? Which I'm such.
Supply RI was more modeled after Cleveland.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
So
Yep.
Cleveland is really a great model for anchor procurement and purchase of goods and services. Cincinnati is more on the corporate side, businesses like P&G, Kroger's, Fifth Third Bank, so real, you know, companies and financial institutions. Though they're beginning to copy or adapt the Cleveland anchor procurement model as well. And, you know, one thing, Toonie, which is really interesting, Cincinnati designates their business districts. They have 35 business districts in the city of Cincinnati. And we've been working with a network of philanthropies, CDFIs, the banks, the Urban Land Bank, at doing a current state, what's the health of these business districts? And what could they be if you go back to that earlier slide about a bigger notion of demand, anchor demand, firm demand, nonprofit demand. So Cincinnati is trying to think through, could all of our business districts, even those in disadvantaged neighborhoods, be vibrant and vital? And how we matchmake between demand and supply. So these guys are intensely focused. I mean, I've never really seen a place like it. They don't have what you have on the workforce side. So you need to really say, we're really good at that. I think you should do even more in real jobs, all right, but you're really good at that stuff. You are like, when we go into other places and people say, what do you do on human capital? Look at Rhode Island, you know, so.
Oh yeah, we've done a great job in the Skills for RI with our, it starts like with that high school Prepare RI program that we launched 3 years ago. And they're taking it virtual right now, which is pretty.
It's great stuff.
Yeah, and then Scott's team at DLT, you're right, the Real Jobs has been amazing asset to the state. For any of you who want information on the Supply RI program, that program's fantastic and growing, and we have more and more anchors signing up for it all the time. So Mary is also sharing a ton of links for more information from Bruce's reports. He is an expert on all of this, and he has tons of free content out there. So anyone who wants to do a deep dive, just start Googling and you'll find it, or reach out to
My only currency is Dell's lemonade.
Your only currency. I don't know how we ship that to you wherever you are in the world, Bruce.
I think they make gallon tubs of it.
Oh, I for a while I was just hauling it back, you know. Like,
did you use the dry mix and try to make it yourself?
I used the dry mix, not the same. You know?
It's not the same. I grind Dell's too.
Well, they found ways of free. You know, we'll try to send you a, you know, packed up one with a bunch of dry ice.
Yeah, we have it on our main street in Wickford, Rhode Island. I know we have Dell's set up, and that's, you know, pulling business into the stores. That's awesome.
That stuff is a drug.
We'll throw you a New York system in that same package.
Is there anything else that you noticed that I missed in the chat?
We do have a report coming out on the Latino numbers.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm going to try to, you know, this data set is a lot, it's a lot more difficult to work with than I thought it would be. So, but we will get those numbers out. We thought we would, you know, but I think these, you know, generally speaking, you know, the ecosystem you need for small business development and business district regeneration is ubiquitous, but you need additional emphasis, I think, in certain communities and constituencies. If you don't, you're not going to get results. I mean, it's not that complicated, really. I mean, we've been doing supplier diversity and inclusion, anchor procurement for decades. We should see better results by now. And I think it's just this gap between the top level, goal setting and the ground and the ecosystem, which has to basically harness all that. We haven't, the federal officials, I think, just don't think about that. So we need the local to lead the national, basically, in my view, not the other way around.
And how do we best do that, Bruce? Right? It's education, right? It's just not something that they're even aware of, or, is it education? How do we lead?
I think there's no surprise to anyone on this call. The reason why the Booker bill is supported by Cory Booker, who's the former mayor of Newark. So, I think bottom line, when you have a local official who becomes a U.S. senator or a congressman, like Dave Cicilline, they get this stuff. So we need more of them to basically infect national policy making with a localist perspective, or else you just end up with all these goals and press releases, and we wake up 5 years later and go, what was that all about? So we have to reverse engineer national policy and then begin to support this infrastructure. I think the feds support certain kinds of community intermediaries, but not others, right? So there's more disproportionate, sort of focus on community development corporations as housing players, but not as players that can connect demand and supply in the market,
We're not growing in the same way that we were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago in the United States in terms of population. And all these initiatives to, reinvigorate our urban spaces is excellent. I don't know, I guess there's only so many places can grow, right?
Yeah, I don't think you have that challenge in Rhode Island to a large extent.
Oh, not here. I'm just, more.
Yeah.
There's going to be some places that aren't acting, right?
I do think, so there's both the sort of general growth that occurs, but also the spatial distribution of it. From my perspective, if smart growth had taken hold, and you've got great advocates for smart growth in Rhode Island, the Superman building would already be renovated. So, Rhode Island went through a period of employment decentralization where firms moved out of the core and basically located in a lot of these exurban campuses. And I do think that's been excessive, and it's undermined your productivity and your innovation. If you look at the great, sort of success stories of the past 25 years in the United States, not just the Seattles, but the Denvers, the Austins, the Nashvilles, et cetera, it's because they co-located so much of their innovative economy in a relatively small geography, both their downtowns and around their universities and hospitals and healthcare research. You're sort of a small state that's highly dispersed, which is not a great place to be in some respects. So I think you'll always be able, because of the Boston, New York corridor, to have growth, but how that gets arrayed spatially is really critical. Look, there's parts of the country that have underperformed for the last 25 years because so much of the growth has happened in 25 metropolitan areas in the US, including Boston. I think part of that is economic restructuring. I think a large part of that is where investment capital flows. Investment capital is unbelievably lazy. 83% of our venture capital goes to 3 states, and to a large extent it goes to Boston, Silicon Valley, and New York. It's unbelievably lazy and has a very narrow, biased view of what innovation is. That has to change in the aftermath of this crisis, or these crises. Then we'll see more possibilities. Ag science in St. Louis should be a major part of what that metropolitan area does. And they shouldn't have to grow firms and then have them leave to Silicon Valley because of the preference of venture capital. I mean, we've got some market failure that we got to deal with here.
I loved your whole approach. I have a question though, because in Massachusetts, the data is showing us that I think it's like over 78% of the businesses are micro businesses, right? So below 250 and annual 250K in annual revenue, under 5 employees. And there's like somewhat of a push to how do we support those businesses? I understand the idea of scaling, growing businesses. Like there's, Stanford has a Latino entrepreneurship program highly focused on scale businesses. There's also the Eastern Bank, Business Equity Initiative, which is focused on scaling Black and Brown businesses in Massachusetts. But how do we work with those tiny ones, which represent the bulk, right, of Main Street, and help them scale? Like, what's the solution there? Because there's not enough investment that goes into them, and I get some of them are what we call like lifestyle survival businesses, but we've got to change that.
Well, I think this is a great question. It really gets to the heart of, I'm working on a paper right now. It'll be out, I think it'll be out in August, where we are basically saying, and this is a paper about what is a small business administration for the 21st century, let's say. I'm not even sure it should be called a small business administration, but let's just start with that. Well, you can have a definition of that all small business are firms below 500. That's just ridiculous. You've got to segment the market, and the market you're describing requires different thinking, right? I mean, radically different thinking about capital fit, about entrepreneurial training and mentoring around the whole ecosystem. So, we are a sophisticated nation in theory, but we've been lazy on this topic for a very long period of time. So I think what we need is a burst of energy that allows us to segment what are radically different kinds of small businesses, and then really start the innovation around products and practices and commercial real estate, which obviously is going to be another one of the victims and casualties of these crises. So let's just, I was chief of staff at HUD. We had a major budget around research and development, right? Data, analytics. We built networks of researchers all over the country. SBA barely has any of this stuff. So it's not surprising there is no leadership. They have an office of advocacy as opposed to an office of research. So they don't quite treat this as a serious discipline. That has to change. I mean, it really has to change markedly. So I think what you're describing has to be a major push of the next administration, knock on wood, nonpartisan statement. Let's just have truth and science back in our country again.
Yeah, thank you. And I am interested in your Latino report when it comes out. So
yeah, no, that'll we're going to try to get that out as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I told you on our call that we partnered with the state. I think Sue Lee and I started working on it March 27th, and I think our governor announced it on March 28th, and we kicked it off. It's an expansion of our office hours program at District Hall Venture Cafe Providence, in partnership with the state, with Sue Lee, who you know, and with Tech Collective. And we called it the Small Business Tech Support Program. But I, from the beginning, kept saying, because this is my specialty, as you know, the micro businesses, the existing Rhode Island small businesses that I'm a champion of so passionately. I kept saying, oh, this is great, but we have to meet them where they're at. We have to have empathy. We have to. So through this, months later, we developed a concierge program. So there's a handful of us that is their first touch with this program. And we identify where they're at so we can meet them there and push them to our amazing volunteer advisors that can help them with their digital transformation in this new reality that we're in. So we've been able to help over 300 businesses, and trying hard to keep it standing up, because this is a marathon that had, to be honest, this program has been needed for decades, as you know, because I screamed out loud and you were the first one who I really felt heard by. There are so many programs. I'm leading to my question. Social Enterprise Greenhouse, as you know, is doing a fantastic job
Yeah.
Working in these communities we're talking about today. You know, they hired Juan Carlos here to work with Newport, which is where I am right now. That's a super misunderstood community in Rhode Island. And then they have Jessica working on Central Falls and Pawtucket. You know, we're here, we're the bridge to connect anyone to the resources they need to grow, with a specific passionate focus on underrepresented communities. There's VMS that we merged into RIHub in the end of December. There's SBDC. There are all these resources, but it's so hard to get the information to the people, the entrepreneurs that need it most. Do you have, in closing, do you have any suggestions to help us expedite that, Bruce?
Well, I do think, I mean, I believe in localism, but I also believe that in certain periods of national evolution, the national government actually is supposed to do certain things. And so this is one of those moments, right? And so I do think, you know, what is ironic about the US is how much we celebrate micro business in a way and how little we do about it. And the background for all you, the innovation is for everyone, is I think the reason is we've narrowly defined innovation as really around a few R&D, commercialization, technological advancement, mostly white, right? That's how we've defined innovation. And that's where all this capital flows, right? Particularly in an advanced R&D system we have with NIH and NSF and DARPA and all that stuff. We have to redefine innovation in a very broad way. And then we have to put our money where our mouth is. You know, in the CARES Act, the one that originally passed, only $10 million was allocated to the Minority Business Development Agency. 0.0000001%, right? I mean, it's outrageous, actually. And so I think we're having this moment where we need to have a radical rebalancing, you know, in our economy, a radical restructuring. And so the feds, this is what I've been sort of working on the past 2 months, is trying to think through what is a radically different approach to quote unquote small business that could begin in 2021 and then take hold over the course of the next 10 to 25 years, you know, on every level possible, right?
Amber, on our first session that was so fantastic, brought up the fact that friends of hers in other states have received grants to kick off their businesses.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think if the Booker bill passes, we will actually have that first dollop of federal support for this different thesis. Because, you know, it's only a crisis like this that would ever, and by the way, this is a bipartisan bill. Mm-hmm. It's not, this is the reason why it's for real, is that a whole bunch of Republican senators have seen rural main streets and rural businesses collapse. So what are your options right now, right? I mean, so I you know, it's what you've always talked about too. This is a time for both rethinking the fundamentals, reframing the paradigm. Everything else is mostly derivative, really. You know, I mean, we have to, it's the big idea, which then can drive a lot of the disparate questions and, you know, what Betty and others were talking about.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I think we have to set you free, Bruce, as much as I want to just be a parasite and ride around with you all the time because you inspire me. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We really appreciate it.